The lawyer cleared his throat, a dry rustle of paper and condescension. Ilara stood before his polished desk, hands clasped, the worn fabric of her dress the only dark spot in the sunlit office. Her father had been buried 2 days prior, a simple pine box lowered into the hard ground of Providence Creek's cemetery. The town had watched, their faces a mixture of pity and impatience. Now, the final accounting was at hand. Your father, Thomas, was not a man of significant means, Mr. Blackwood began, adjusting his spectacles. After settling his debts with the mercantile and the smith, what remains is this. He pushed a single folded document across the desk. It was a deed. Ilara recognized the spidery script of her father's hand on a notation in the margin. She did not reach for it. Her portion of the grief was still too raw, a hollow space in her chest that made breathing a conscious effort. She was 19, and with her father gone, she was utterly alone. Her mother had passed years ago, and they had no other kin in this rugged territory. Her father had been a peat cutter in the old country, a trade that meant nothing here, where timber was king. It is a parcel of land, the lawyer continued, his tone suggesting he was delivering bad news. 40 acres north of the creek, the tract known as the Hollow Marsh. He paused, letting the name hang in the air like a bad smell. The Hollow Marsh was a joke in Providence Creek, a sodden, useless bog where the ground drank the sun and gave back nothing but mosquitoes and sour mud. And his accounts? Ilara's voice was quiet, barely a whisper. Mr. Blackwood slid a small leather pouch beside the deed. The clink was pathetic. $7.42. That is the entirety of the estate, miss, the deed and the cash. He leaned back, his duty done. The unspoken question filled the room. What would she do now? A 19-year-old girl with $7 and a swamp. The community had its answer ready. Mr. Gable, the owner of the mercantile, had already offered his counsel, his voice thick with false sympathy. "A girl like you can't manage on her own," he'd said at the graveside. "Sell that worthless deed for whatever you can get. A few dollars, maybe. I might have some work for you, laundry, mending. You can sleep in the storeroom." His offer was framed as charity, but it felt like a cage. She had seen the other girls who slept in storerooms. They became ghosts, their youth and spirit worn away by thankless labor until they faded into the town's background, forever indebted, forever dependent. Her father, for all his quiet ways, had prized his independence above all else. He had taught her to read, to cipher, and to look at the land not for what it was, but for what it could be. Ilara finally reached out and took the deed. Her fingers traced the outline of the parcel. 40 acres of mud and reeds. She then picked up the pouch of coins. The weight was nothing. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice finding a sliver of steel. She turned and walked out of the office, leaving the lawyer staring after her, a faint look of surprise on his face. She did not go to the mercantile. She did not go to the church to beg for aid. She walked to the blacksmith and bought a good, sharp spade, the kind used for cutting thick sod. It cost her $1. She went to the mercantile, avoiding Mr. Gable's eye, and spent another $4 on flour, salt, beans, a small sack of potatoes, a cast-iron pot, a sharp knife, and a ball of twine. She had $2.42 left. With the deed in one pocket and the coins in the other, she turned her back on Providence Creek and began to walk north. The journey was a penance. The late autumn air had a sharp edge, a promise of the winter to come. The sack of supplies grew heavier with every mile. The road dwindled from a wagon-rutted track to a faint deer trail, and the ground beneath her feet grew soft and yielding. The tall pines and sturdy oaks gave way to stunted willows and skeletal tamaracks. The air grew thick with the smell of damp earth, a rich, loamy scent she remembered from her father's stories. By late afternoon, she arrived. She stood on a slight rise, looking out at her inheritance, the hollow marsh. It was worse than she had imagined, a vast, gray-green expanse of stagnant pools and hummocks of coarse grass. The water, where it showed, was the color of weak tea. A cold wind swept across it, making the reeds whisper like a crowd of gossips. There was no timber to speak of, no solid ground on which to build. It was a place of rot and decay. For a long moment, despair washed over her like the icy bog water itself. Her knees felt weak. The town was right. Her father had left her nothing. This was a grave, not a home. Tears burned in her eyes, hot and useless against the cold wind. She had been a fool, marching out here with a spade and a sack of flour, fueled by a stubborn pride that now seemed like the most pathetic kind of vanity. She sank to her knees on the damp ground, the weight of her sack and her grief pinning her down. She thought of her father, of his calloused hands, and the faint, earthy smell that always clung to him. He used to tell her stories of the old country, of houses built not of wood, but of the earth itself. Houses of peat, he'd called them. The land gives you the walls and the fire to warm them, he'd say. A peat house holds the heat like a cupped hand. Her gaze drifted across the marsh. It wasn't just mud, it was peat. Miles of it. Generations of compacted moss and sedge compressed into a dense, dark mat. Fuel. Building material. She stood up, her body aching, and walked down into the bog. She found a spot where a small channel of water had cut into the bank, revealing the layers beneath the grass. It was a cross-section of her land. A foot of root-choked sod, and then, below it, the peat. Dark, dense, and deep. She took her new spade. She remembered her father describing the tool they used, a slane. This would have to do. She drove the spade into the dark earth. It sliced in with a satisfying, wet sound. She pried back a block, a thick, brown brick of the earth. It was heavy, saturated with water, but it held its shape. She lifted it, feeling its weight. It was real. It was solid. Then she noticed something else. As she stood in the slight depression, the wind that had been cutting her to the bone seemed to lessen. The high bank of the marsh, though only a few feet tall, deflected the relentless current of air. The air in the hollow felt still, almost calm. She pressed her hand against the exposed wall of peat. It was cold, yes, but it was a neutral, earthy cold, not the biting chill of the wind. It was a barrier. It was shelter. A plan, desperate and born of necessity, began to form in her mind. She would not build on the bog. She would build in it. She would dig her home down into the peat, using the earth itself as 3 of her walls, and the peat she excavated as the 4th. The land would provide the walls, and the land would provide the fuel. Her father's words came back to her, no longer a fairy tale, but a blueprint for survival. Hope, grim and fierce, took root in the despair. This worthless land had a secret, and she was going to dig it out. The work was brutal. The first task was to dig the pit that would become her home. She chose a spot on the edge of the marsh, where a natural rise in the ground offered a bit more drainage and a taller bank to dig into. She marked out a rectangle, 12 feet by 16 feet, using sticks and twine. Then she began to dig. The top layer was a tangled mess of sedge roots and tough grasses that fought the spade at every turn. She had to use her knife to saw through the thickest roots, her hands quickly blistering. Once she broke through that living skin, she reached the peat. It was easier to cut, but heavier to move. Each spadeful was a dense, sodden weight that had to be lifted and thrown into a wheelbarrow she'd fashioned from a discarded crate and a broken wheel found near the road. Her muscles, unaccustomed to such labor, screamed in protest. By the end of the first day, she had cleared only a few square feet. Her back was a column of fire, her hands were raw and bleeding, and she was coated in a layer of black mud. She ate a cold potato and a piece of bread, then huddled under an oilcloth she'd brought, shivering as the temperature dropped. The night was filled with the strange sounds of the bog, the croaking of frogs, the slap of water, the cry of some unseen bird. It was a world of profound, terrifying loneliness. But every morning she rose with the sun, her body stiff and sore, and returned to the pit. She fell into a rhythm dictated by sheer endurance. Dig, lift, haul. Dig, lift, haul. As she worked, she wasn't just digging a hole, she was harvesting her building materials. She cut the peat into uniform blocks, about 2 feet long and a foot wide and deep. She learned to use the spade like her father had described, slicing cleanly through the dense material. She stacked these wet, heavy bricks, turves, he had called them, in long, low rows away from the pit. She arranged them with gaps in between, like a loose brick wall, so the wind could pass through and begin the long drying process. The water had to be driven out before they could be used for building or burning. It was a race against the coming winter. Days turned into a week, then 2. The pit grew deeper, first 2 feet, then 4, then 6. She dug down until she hit a layer of dense, blue-gray clay. This would be her floor. The clay was nearly waterproof, a barrier against the dampness of the bog. She painstakingly leveled it, tamping it down with her feet and a flat stone, until it was hard and even. 3 walls of her home were now complete, solid vertical faces of dark peat. While the pit was being dug, the turves she had cut first were slowly drying. They became lighter, harder, and changed color from a dark brown to a dusty black. She tested one, holding it in her hands. It was half the weight of a wet block, but felt as solid as a piece of wood. It worked. The ancient knowledge was true. Now she needed a 4th wall and a roof. For that, she needed timber, the one thing her land did not provide. She spent 2 days scavenging along the edges of the marsh and the nearby creek, dragging back fallen branches and dead trees. It was grueling work, hauling heavy logs for miles. She found a stand of straight, slender pines, killed by a past fire, their wood seasoned and light. She used a small hand axe, another of her precious purchases, to chop them to length. With the timber gathered, she began to build the front wall. She laid a foundation of the driest, hardest peak bricks on the clay floor. Then she started stacking. She laid the bricks in an overlapping pattern, like a mason would lay stone, leaving spaces for a door and a small window. She had no mortar. Instead, she used a thick slurry of clay and mud, packing it into the joints to seal them against the wind. The roof was the most difficult part. She laid her longest logs across the pit, from the top of her peat brick wall to the solid ground of the bank behind. This formed the main rafters. Across these, she laid smaller branches, creating a dense lattice. On top of this, she layered thick sheets of bark she had peeled from dead trees. The final layer was the sod she had first dug up from the pit. She laid these grassy squares upside down onto the roof, their tangled roots forming a living thatch that would hold the structure together and provide insulation. She left a square hole in the roof for a chimney. Her stove, still wrapped in burlap, waited. She built a small, raised platform of clay and flat stones for it to sit on, and carefully assembled the stovepipe, guiding it up through the roof opening. She packed more clay and mud around the pipe to seal the gap. The door was a crude affair. Planks from a broken crate, nailed together, hung on leather hinges. The window was a frame with no glass. She would cover it with a piece of oiled hide when the deep cold came. After nearly a month of relentless, back-breaking labor, she stood back and looked at her creation. It was less a house and more a part of the land itself. A low mound rising from the earth, with a single door and a puff of stovepipe. The roof was already sprouting a few blades of new grass. From a distance, it was nearly invisible. That evening, for the first time, she went inside. The air was still and cool, smelling of damp earth and clay. She built a fire in the small stove, using a handful of the driest peat turves. They caught slowly, smoldering at first, then glowing with an intense, steady heat. There was little flame and almost no smoke, just a deep, radiating warmth that began to push back the chill. The cast iron of the stove ticked as it expanded. The warmth filled the small space, and the stone-hard clay floor and dense peat walls began to absorb it. She sat on a low stool she had made, watching the glow through the stove's grate. The wind howled outside, a distant, muffled sound. It could not touch her here. The cold could not claw its way through the thick earth. She had built more than a shelter. She had built a fortress against the winter. Her hands were scarred, her nails broken, her body a map of aches and bruises. But as the warmth soaked into her bones, a feeling of profound, weary pride settled over her. She was still there. She had built a home from nothing. With the main structure complete, her work shifted to systems. Shelter was not enough. She needed heat, water, and food for the long winter ahead. The most critical resource was fuel. Every day, she spent hours cutting more peat turves. The bog was a limitless mine. She cut and stacked, building great dark walls of fuel that dried in the wind. She calculated how much she would need, then doubled it. She would not be caught short. The stacks grew into small black hills around her dwelling. For water, she relied on the bog itself. The brown, tea-colored water was clean, filtered by the peat, but she wanted a more reliable source. Beside her home, she dug a small, deep pit, about 4 feet across and 6 feet deep, lining it meticulously with the same blue clay from her floor. It was a painstaking process, pressing the wet clay into a seamless bowl to create a waterproof cistern. Rain and groundwater slowly seeped in, filtered through a layer of sand and charcoal she placed at the bottom. Within a week, she had a small well of clear, cold water right outside her door. Food was a constant worry. Her initial supplies were dwindling. She set snare lines in the scrubland bordering the marsh, using the twine she had bought. Her father had taught her the simple loops and triggers. On the third day, she caught a rabbit. Skinning and cooking it over her peat fire felt like a feast. She caught another a few days later. It wasn't much, but it was sustenance. She also began preparing a small garden, a project that seemed insane in the late autumn. Against the south-facing front wall of her house, she built a low, 3-sided frame of sod blocks. The wall of her home would provide shelter from the wind and radiate a tiny amount of warmth. She filled the frame with the best soil she could find, mixing it with ash from her stove. In it, she planted a few of her seed potatoes and some hardy kale seeds she'd thought to buy. It was a desperate gamble, but any green thing that grew would be a miracle. By now, 6 weeks had passed since she'd left Providence Creek. Her money was almost gone, and she needed things she could not make. More salt, a little lard, perhaps a needle and thread. She loaded her wheelbarrow with a dozen of her driest, best-formed peat bricks and made the long walk back to town. Her arrival at Gable's Mercantile caused a stir. The men loafing on the porch fell silent, staring. Mr. Gable himself came out, wiping his hands on his apron. He looked her up and down, her mud-stained dress, her calloused hands, her face tanned by the wind. Then he looked at the strange, black bricks in her wheelbarrow. "Elada," he said, his voice a mix of surprise and pity. We thought you'd have come back long before now." "I need a few supplies, Mr. Gable," she said, her voice steady. "I have these to trade." She indicated the peat bricks. He picked one up, turning it over in his hands. It was surprisingly light and hard. "What in God's name is this?" a man on the porch asked, laughing. "It's peat," Elara said simply. "For a fire." Gable scoffed, a short, sharp sound of derision. "Girl, this is timber country. No one's going to burn dirt when there's a forest of oak and pine for the taking." He tossed the brick back into the wheelbarrow. "I can't give you anything for this. It's worthless." The men chuckled. The nickname they had for her was whispered just loud enough for her to hear. The Bog Witch. Her face burned, but her resolve hardened. "Fine," she said. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her last $1.50. "I'll pay cash." She bought her salt and a small packet of needles, leaving her with less than $1 to her name. As she turned to leave, pushing her wheelbarrow of rejected fuel, Gable called after her. "My offer still stands, Elara. There's warmer places to sleep than a mud hole." More laughter followed her down the street. She did not look back. The mockery was a physical weight, but it also forged something new in her, a cold, hard anger that fueled her steps all the way back to the marsh. They thought her a fool. She would prove them wrong. It was on that walk back, her spirit at its lowest ebb since the first day, that she found him. A scruffy, mud-caked dog, so thin his ribs showed like a washboard under his matted fur. He was rooting around a trash heap on the edge of town, and he looked up at her with wary, intelligent eyes. He had a hurt paw, which he held off the ground. She stopped. She had nothing to spare, not even a scrap of food. But she couldn't leave him. She broke off a piece of the hard bread she'd bought for herself and tossed it to him. He snatched it and swallowed it in a single gulp. She slowly approached, speaking in a low, calm voice. He watched her, but didn't run. She saw that he was just a young dog, lost and starving. "Well," she sighed, "I suppose we're both strays." He limped after her as she left the town behind. He followed her all the way back to the Peat house, keeping a cautious distance. When she reached her door, he sat 20 feet away, watching. That night, she left out a bowl with a little water and the last of her rabbit stew. In the morning, the bowl was clean, and the dog was asleep by her door, his head on his paws. She named him Moss. He became her shadow, her companion, her only guard. His presence filled the immense silence of the bog, a warm, breathing comfort in the vast emptiness. The last days of autumn faded, and the air grew colder. A hard frost coated the marsh in a glittering sheet of white. The surface of the stagnant pools froze over. The wind had a new, more serious bite. This was the time for final preparations. Elara worked with a quiet urgency, her movements economical and sure. Her world had shrunk to this small patch of earth and the rhythms of survival. Her daily routine was a litany of tasks. At dawn, she would rise in the gentle, steady warmth of her home. The peat fire, banked with sod, would still be glowing. She would add a few fresh bricks, and the heat would swell again. The stove was the heart of her home, a black iron god she tended with reverence. Its warmth was a physical presence, a shield against the world. Then she would go outside with Moss, into the sharp, clean cold. She would check her snares, rebaiting them if necessary. Some days they were empty. Other days they yielded a rabbit or a grouse, and she would feel a surge of gratitude. She would break the ice on her cistern to draw water for the day. She would tend her tiny garden, which, to her astonishment, was growing. Sheltered by the house and the sod wall, a small patch of hardy green kale was pushing up through the soil. It was a miracle of defiance against the season. Most of the day was spent on maintenance. She chinked any new cracks in her wall with fresh clay. She added more sod to the roof, thickening the insulation. She carved tools and utensils from scavenged wood, a spoon, a bowl, a hook to hang her pot. She mended her clothes with the needles she had bought. Moss would lie by the fire, a watchful, silent presence. The people of Providence Creek had all but forgotten her, except as a cautionary tale told by firesides. The Bog Witch and her mud house. A hunter named Brant, known for his arrogance, had passed by her land once. He had seen the wisp of smoke from her stovepipe and the great stacks of black bricks. He'd ridden into town and told everyone he'd seen it with his own eyes. "Living in a hole in the ground like a badger," he'd bellowed in Gable's store, "and burning dirt for heat. She'll be a frozen corpse by Christmas." Elara heard nothing of this. Her world was the smell of peat smoke, the warmth of the stove, the soft breathing of her dog, and the deep, profound silence of the winter marsh. She was not just surviving, she was content. The small earthen room was her kingdom. It was warm, it was dry, and it was hers. She had built it from the worthless land that was her only inheritance. Small tests came before the great one. A week of freezing rain encased the entire marsh in a thick shell of ice. Her roof held. The water shed off the frozen sod and away from her walls. Inside, the fire never faltered. Wolves, driven by hunger, circled her home one night, their howls echoing across the frozen bog. Moss stood at the door, a low growl rumbling in his chest, and they did not dare approach the strange-smelling mound. A small, early blizzard blew through, a preview of what was to come. For 2 days, the world was a blur of white. Elara stayed inside, warm and secure, rationing her food and fuel, listening to the storm rage. The systems held. She was ready. Then came the blizzard of '83. It did not arrive like other storms. It descended like a hammer blow from a slate-gray sky. The wind came first, a low moan that rose to a piercing shriek. It drove the snow not down but sideways, in a blinding, horizontal torrent. The temperature plummeted, dropping 20, then 30, then 40 degrees in a matter of hours. The world outside Elara's door ceased to exist, replaced by a screaming vortex of white and cold. Inside her peat house, the storm was a distant rumor. The wind howled over the low profile of her roof, unable to get a purchase. The snow, instead of being a threat, became an ally. It piled up against her front wall and over her roof, burying her home even deeper, adding layer upon layer of perfect insulation. The sound of the gale became a dull, muffled roar. The peat stove glowed with its steady, tireless heat. The dense earthen walls, now thoroughly warmed, radiated a gentle comfort back into the room. The temperature inside held firm, a pocket of impossible warmth in the heart of the Arctic fury. Elara fed the fire, checked on her small store of food, and drank fresh water from her cistern, which, buried deep beside the house, had not frozen. Moss slept peacefully by the hearth. She was not fighting the storm. She was simply outside its reach, an island of calm in an ocean of chaos. In Providence Creek, it was a different story. The town was built of wood, and wood was no match for this cold. The wind, sharp as a knife, found every crack, every seam, every gap in the chinking. It stripped the heat from the houses as fast as the fires could make it. Families huddled around their stoves, feeding them constantly, but the cold crept in, relentless and invasive. Frost formed on the inside of walls. Water froze in buckets just feet from the hearth. Section. The town's confidence shattered. The very structures that represented their prosperity and security were failing them. Roofs, not designed for the sheer weight of the dense, wind-packed snow, began to groan and creak. The sound of splintering timber was heard over the howl of the wind as the livery stable's roof collapsed, crushing the animals inside. Firewood, which had seemed so abundant, was being consumed at a terrifying rate. Those who had not laid in a massive supply saw their woodpiles dwindle to nothing. Mr. Gable's house, one of the finest in town, with its glass windows and 2 stories, became an icebox. The wind rattled the panes and drove fine powder snow through the sashes. He and his family burned through their entire winter supply of oak in 2 days. The house was bleeding heat. His wife and their 8-year-old daughter, Lydia, were wrapped in every blanket they owned, but their shivering would not stop. On the 3rd day of the storm, Lydia developed a cough, a dry, rasping sound that quickly turned wet and ragged. Her breath came in shallow, painful gasps. Her forehead was burning with fever. Panic set in. The doctor was trapped in his own home, his own firewood nearly gone. No one could travel. The town was a collection of isolated, freezing prisons. Mr. Gable, a man defined by his practicality and his pride, was reduced to a desperate father watching his child die. He had run out of wood. He had run out of options. He had run out of hope. And then, through the haze of fear and cold, a memory surfaced. A girl with mud on her dress and strange black bricks in a wheelbarrow, a wisp of smoke rising from a hole in the ground. The hunter Brant's mocking words came back to him. Burning dirt for heat. At the time it had been a joke. Now it was a sliver of an impossible chance. Dirt that burned. A house made of earth. A house that might, just might, be warm. The decision was madness. To go out into that storm was suicide, but to stay was to watch his daughter die. He wrapped himself in every layer of clothing he owned, pulled a thick wool scarf over his face, and took a small, desperate bundle of food. His wife begged him not to go, her voice choked with tears. "I have to," he said, his own voice cracking. "It's the only way." He kissed his daughter's hot forehead, stepped out of his house, and was immediately swallowed by the white fury of the storm. He could not see more than 3 feet in front of him. The wind tore at him, a physical force that threatened to knock him off his feet. The cold was a living entity, sinking its teeth into any exposed flesh. He navigated by memory and instinct, keeping the line of the creek on his left. He stumbled, fell, and rose again, driven by the image of Lydia's pale, feverish face. It was a journey of a few miles that felt like 100. More than once he thought he was lost, that he would freeze to death just yards from safety. After what felt like an eternity, he stumbled into the relative quiet of the hollow marsh. The wind was lessened here, deflected by the landscape. He staggered forward, half blind, his body screaming with cold. And then he saw it. A low mound, almost completely buried in snow, with a thin ribbon of smoke rising from a stovepipe, dispersing instantly in the gale. It was the only sign of human life in the entire frozen world. He fell to his knees, crawling the last few feet, and banged his frozen fist on the crude wooden door. Inside, the sound was a dull, muffled thud. Moss lifted his head and let out a low growl. Ilara stood up, her heart pounding. No one should be out in this. No one could be. She listened. The banging came again, weaker this time, followed by a slumping sound. She grabbed a heavy piece of wood she used as a door bar and cracked the door open a few inches. The wind screamed through the opening, throwing a blast of snow and Arctic air into the warm room. Sprawled on her doorstep was a figure so encased in snow and ice it was barely human. Moss barked, a sharp, urgent sound. Elara knew she had a choice. Her fuel was plentiful, but not infinite. Her food was carefully rationed. Whoever this was, they would be a drain on her precious resources. And they were likely from the town that had scorned her, that had called her a witch. A bitter, cold part of her wanted to shut the door and let the storm have them. But then she saw the desperation in the way the figure had clawed at her door. This was not a visitor. This was a soul at the end of its rope. Her father had taught her many things about survival. But the greatest lesson was that you did not let another person freeze if you had a fire. She jammed the door open, the wind fighting her, and with strength she didn't know she possessed, she dragged the half-frozen body inside and slammed the door shut, plunging the room back into warm, quiet stillness. She pulled the snow-crusted scarf away from the face. It was Mr. Gable. His skin was waxy and pale, his lips blue. His eyes were barely open, glazed with shock and cold. He was shivering violently, uncontrollably. For a moment, she just stared at the man who had publicly humiliated her, the man who had offered her a life of servitude in his storeroom, now helpless on her floor. The moment passed. He was not Mr. Gable, the proud merchant. He was a dying man. She acted quickly, her movements precise. She pulled off his frozen outer layers, which were as stiff as boards. She wrapped him in the warmest blankets she had, rough wool things she had woven herself. She sat him on the stool near the stove, the waves of heat washing over him. She brewed a hot, sweet tea from herbs she had gathered and forced him to drink it, holding the cup to his trembling lips. He coughed, the hot liquid reviving him. His eyes slowly began to focus. He looked around the small room, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. The first thing that hit him was the warmth. It was not the scorching, temporary heat of a wood fire, but a deep, steady, radiant warmth that seemed to come from the very walls. The air was calm. There were no drafts. His gaze fell upon the stove, glowing with a dull, red heat. Beside it was a neat stack of the black bricks he had scorned. He saw the tidy shelves with her jars of preserves and sacks of food. He saw the small patch of green kale growing in a box near the wall, an impossible splash of life. He saw the sleeping dog, the orderly tools, the general sense of peace and security. This was not the miserable mud-hole of his imagination. This was a sanctuary. He looked at Elara, who was tending the fire. He saw not a witch, not a fool, but a young woman of incredible strength and resourcefulness. The shame hit him like a physical blow, so powerful it almost drove the cold from his bones. "My daughter," he croaked, his voice raw. "Lydia. She's sick. A fever. We have no more wood." Elara listened without a word, her expression unreadable. He expected scorn, a bitter, "I told you so." He deserved it. He braced himself for her to tell him to leave, to let him face the consequences of his own pride. Instead, she simply nodded. "We will need a sled," she said, her voice calm and practical. She went to a corner and pulled out a crude but sturdy sled she had built for hauling peat. She began loading it, not with a few bricks, but with dozens of them, a heavy, generous supply. She packed a small sack with some of her precious potatoes and a handful of the kale. She filled a canteen with fresh water. Gable stared, dumbfounded. "Why?" he managed to ask. We called you a fool." Elara paused and looked at him. Her eyes held no triumph, no malice, only a quiet, weary gravity. "Your daughter is cold," she said. "I have a fire." It was the simplest, most profound statement he had ever heard. It was not about forgiveness or revenge. It was about fact. She had what they needed, and she would give it. She helped him back into his driest clothes and gave him a thick piece of bread. When the worst of the storm's fury had passed into a slightly less violent gale, they ventured out. The journey back was an ordeal, but with two of them, and the hope of the fuel on the sled, it was manageable. They reached Gable's house to find his wife frantic with worry and relief. They brought the peat into the house and put it in the stove. It caught, and for the first time in days, a deep, lasting warmth began to fill the frigid room. Gable looked at the black brick glowing in his stove, the worthless dirt that was now saving his family. "My God," he whispered to his wife, "we were the fools." Elara did not stay. She showed them how to use the peat, how to bank the fire to make it last. She looked at the sick child, pale and shivering under a mountain of quilts. She left the kale and potatoes on the table. "Make her a broth," she said quietly. Then, with a nod, she turned and walked back out into the snow, her dog at her heels, returning to her solitary kingdom in the bog. The blizzard broke 2 days later. As the sun emerged, weak and watery, over a transformed landscape, the people of Providence Creek slowly emerged from their homes. The toll was heavy. Several roofs had collapsed. Livestock was lost. 2 elderly people, living alone, had frozen to death. The town was humbled, its pride shattered by the storm. The story of Mr. Gable's journey and rescue spread like wildfire. At first it was met with disbelief, but the proof was there. The steady, smokeless heat pouring from his chimney, and his daughter Lydia slowly recovering. Gable, a changed man, did not hide his shame. He told everyone what he had found. A home warmer than any in town, built from the earth. A young woman who had not only survived, but thrived. And a generosity that defied all reason. Slowly, the town's perception of Elara shifted. The nickname Bog Witch died on their lips, replaced with a quiet, hesitant respect. A few days after the storm, a delegation of men, led by the hunter Brant, made their way to her home. They found her splitting wood for a new project, Moss watching from the doorway. Brant, a man not known for humility, took off his hat. "Miss," he began, his voice rough with emotion, We came to see how you fared, and to thank you for what you did for Gable." He gestured to a sled they had brought. It was loaded with supplies from the mercantile, a side of bacon, sacks of flour and sugar, bolts of warm wool cloth, and a small pane of glass for her window. Elara looked at the offerings, then at the faces of the men. She saw no mockery there now, only a deep, abiding respect. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. "But I will trade you for it." She pointed to her massive stacks of dried peat. "A sled of supplies for 2 sleds of fuel. That is a fair trade." She was not accepting charity. She was establishing herself as a producer, a vital part of the community's economy. That was the beginning. The town, facing a long winter with depleted wood supplies, began to trade with her. The worthless dirt became a prized commodity, known for its slow, steady burn. Her peat house became a landmark, a place people would visit not out of morbid curiosity, but out of genuine admiration. They would stand in her warm, earthy home and marvel at its simple genius. She taught them how to build with sod and peat, how to find the high, dry ground within the marsh, how to work with the land instead of against it. In the spring, the town of Providence Creek did not rebuild as it had been. Following Alara's example, new homes were built lower to the ground, with thicker walls and sod roofs. They began harvesting peat from the marsh, not as a fuel of last resort, but as a primary source of heat. The landscape of their survival began to change, guided by the quiet wisdom of the woman they had once cast out. Alara never left her home in the bog. She expanded it, adding another room for her growing flock of chickens and a small goat. Her garden flourished. She became a fixture of the region, known for her quiet strength, her practical knowledge, and her unwavering grace. The story of the girl who inherited a swamp and built a fortress became a local legend, a tale told to children about the nature of true wealth. It was not in money or status, but in resilience, in resourcefulness, and in the courage to see value where others saw only waste. She had been given nothing, and from it she had built everything. The story of Alara and her peat house teaches us that what one generation discards as worthless, another may find to be the very key to its survival. It's a powerful reminder that true strength is not the absence of hardship, but the character that is forged in its fires. It is the quiet resolve to build, to endure, and to offer a hand to even those who once pointed in mockery. Her legacy was not written in a will or carved on a grand monument, but in the simple, enduring warmth of a peat fire on a cold winter's night. If this story moved you, share it with someone who believes in the power of quiet resilience. And follow for more stories of courage, survival, and enduring wisdom.